Well, greetings. Again, my name is Stefan Haggard, and this is the lead off of the GPS webinar series on Korea, sponsored by the Korea Pacific Program and the Korea Foundation, which has given us very, very generous support for this series. They were really open to supporting an online presence this fall. So let me just say something very briefly about the school. For those of you who don't know about us, we're a school of public policy and international affairs. We offer 7 degree programs, including a Master's of International Affairs with a Korea specialization. We have a track for professionals in the security of the Asia Pacific. So if you're interested in what we do on Korea, this is exemplary of what we try to do. And so if you're interested in pursuing an advanced degree in this area, please feel free to look at our website. This fall, we have a very diverse set of programs. Next week, we're pleased to have the Mexican ambassador to Seoul, Bruno Figueroa, talking about Mexico's interest in the Korean Peninsula, but also how Korea has handled COVID. We're going to have a panel on COVID with some new research from Jungmin Lee and Munsub Lee here. I'll be moderating that. We have a discussion of the space issue in Northeast Asia, talking about Japanese and Korean space capabilities and what role those might play in cooperation among the 3 countries as their bilateral relations between Korea and Japan have deteriorated. And then a very interesting panel I'm looking forward to with Becoming Kim, who has one of the best books on the North Korean economy, Bill Brown, who's at the Korea Economic Institute, and myself talking about what we know and don't know about the Korean economy. So look for this next week. Again, this is our session for next week on the Korean Peninsula. But let's turn to today's event. I met Jung online doing a webinar up in Orange County, and we really had a terrific time. Jung is one of those people who just enjoys tremendous respect among the North Korea community. It's a strange club, right, Jung? Several hundred people who kind of watch North Korea very closely. And over the years, we've all just gotten to know one another gradually. I've met Jung more recently, but her reputation preceded her. Jung has a PhD in history from Columbia. She taught at Hunter. But what's most interesting about her career is she spent a lot of time at the CIA and at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where she was responsible for intelligence assessments on North Korea, hundreds of them actually, and some quite famous ones, including one called The Education of Kim Jong Un, which is a chapter in her book. And she just has a very good judgment, and she approaches this problem as an intelligence analyst, which I find extremely interesting. There's a lot of the book that deals with this problem of bias and how you overcome bias in trying to assess an adversary. And so for those of you who are interested, I can see we've got a picture of the book up, but if you want a great introduction to Kim Jong Un, please pick this up. Let me just say something very briefly about the format. We're about 50 people, but please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I'll try to moderate the chat as we go along. I certainly don't have a monopoly of wisdom on what's the most appropriate thing to ask, but I'm going to start with Jung and me having a conversation. And Jung, when we talked last time, you said some interesting things about the photo on the book. And I was wondering if you can say something about that. It's kind of a striking image, actually. I don't know who took it, but it's kind of arty. Do you want to talk about the selection of that? Because it sort of speaks to the book more generally.
Thanks, Steph, and thanks to UCSD and GPS for hosting me today. So thank you for inviting me over to talk to you about the book. Steph, thanks for that lovely introduction as well. And it's so, at some point in the near future, I hope we get to see each other in person. And thanks to and thanks to all of you for joining today. I know there are lots of demands on your time, so I always am so deeply appreciative when people tune in to hear about the book, hear about North Korea, hear about Kim Jong Un. So Steph, thanks for that great opening to talk about the book. I love the cover of this book. This is, when I described it to my friends and colleagues and family members, I said, well, it's a psychosocial, historical, national security type book of Kim Jong Un. And when the graphic designers, the cover art designers at Ballantine Books came up, showed me this draft, I thought they got exactly what I was trying to do. I think, Steph, this is a picture of Kim Jong Un being taken at the Singapore summit. So what I like about this cover is that, when you have biographies or autobiographies, the subject space is looking at the viewer, is looking at the observer, straight on. This is me. This is who I am. I'm pouring out my heart and soul into this book. But what this cover shows is our perspective of Kim from above and at a distance. And his gaze is away. He's not looking at you. So you can't really see what he actually looks like. There's shadows that enshroud this picture. He is knowable and unknowable. And I think you can see that from having the title text, blocking the ability to actually look inside this man's soul, right?
I like it.
But he's also walking toward you, but he's also walking into his own shadow. And I think that was so fascinating to me that the designers capture that, in that he's part of this history that his father and his grandfather created, but he's also trying to step out of their shadow into a shadow of his own making. So all of that is, for me, it encapsulated everything that I wanted to do with this book. It seeped into every aspect, every chapter that I wrote, in trying to reveal this very unknowable person, but to piece together the fragments and to use my analytic skills based on my 9 years in the intelligence community and many years doing U.S. history to bring you this holistic picture, shadows and all, warts and all. You might not get the answers that you're looking for, but at least this will give you the tools to how to think about North Korea, how to think about Kim Jong Un, and know that he's not the caricature that I think a lot of other books and a lot of other reporting on Kim tends to be. He's either he's not a flat two-dimensional cartoon figure. He's somebody to be taken seriously. But also, but that, he has hopes and fears and dreams and aspirations, which also hint at the leverage that perhaps we can have in trying to get him to denuclearize.
Yeah, well, that's a great introduction. Munsub in particular, and me as kind of his junior partner in terms of skills, spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get data out of North Korea. But one of the things you tackled, I think I might start with, is the incredible role of family in the book. I mean, I was really struck in rereading it this time in anticipation of this webinar, the way that this is like a sort of family history. It's not just about him, it's about, it's about Kim Il-sung, it's about his father, about his uncles, about his brothers, and so forth. And I often tell my students that I think of North Korea as sort of like a monarchy, with both court politics and problems of succession. So can we talk a little bit about the family? I mean, you talk about, for example, his education. He doesn't come back to Pyongyang until 2001, I think, and he spends a lot of time abroad. What role do you think that both being in Europe and living in this particular bubble of this ultra elite, kind of system, what role does that play in how we think about Kim Jong Un?
I think you're spot on, Steph, in that Kim doesn't appear out of nowhere. He is from a particular point in history. He belongs to this context of this Kim family dynasty. He belongs in the context of the post-Cold War euphoria of Western domination and this moment of unipolarity. But he's also really grounded in the context of who he is and when he was born. In that he is his very being. I focus a lot on the family because he's focused on the family, and because the family is focused on the family. And the history of North Korea is about, in many ways, the history of the Kim family. And so when I look at Kim, I see him in the Kim Jong Un. I see him in the context of, here he is in Switzerland for 4 years at the height of the famine, which you've written about so well. He is swimming in the French Riviera. He is skiing in the Alps. He's going to Euro Disney. He is playing with the latest Nintendo games. He's playing basketball with his European friends. So he's doing all of these things in this particular moment in time when the world is celebrating about the end of conflict. They're celebrating the fall of the Soviet Union. There was this a moment of optimism when people thought there were going to be no wars. The liberal international order led by the United States has won the day. But at the same time, North Korea is suffering the worst famine that killed as many as 1 million people. And we see some of those effects still lingering to this day. But I see Kim as having not known the wars of the famines, or probably not the tortuous negotiations of nuclear negotiations. And he's born into this era of optimism. Optimism in the world, but optimism in North Korea, because his young adult life is when North Korea becomes a nuclear weapons power. It tests its first nuclear weapon. This is when, so in a way, he is a North Korean millennial, the quintessential North Korean millennial, having grown up with a growing North Korean economy, having only known a nuclear North Korea, and seeing himself and seeing themselves as the only country that's still standing despite everything else that has collapsed. The Soviet Union, for example, the fact that others have turned away and others have sold their souls for the mighty dollar, whereas North Korea still stands in the way that they want to be preserved in the way that they want to be preserved.
Yeah, so let me push this family theme a little bit, because this is still something I'm trying to figure out analytically. This is a Communist Party regime. It has military components, and then it has these familial components. And when he came to power, there was a lot of skepticism about whether he would even survive. And then within 2 years, he assassinates his uncle, Jang Pak, kills him, executes him, I guess is more appropriate. And then 4 years later, he kills his brother and seems to consolidate power quite quickly. Were you surprised by his ability to consolidate power, or were you more confident that he would be able to do that?
I would say that I was more confident about his ability to consolidate power. Well, I wasn't as dismissive, I would say. There was speculation, and there were declarations after Kim Jong-il died in December of 2011 that the North Korea as we know it is dead. There's no way that North Korea can survive. There's no way that this young 26-year-old with no government experience, much less ruling a relatively isolated nuclear armed country and poor country, is going to survive the rough and tumble knife fights of North Korea. But what we saw, and I think that and I think this is part of the intel training, right? You don't dismiss. You don't let your own perceptions of what the right age is, or what your own perceptions really cloud some of the things that somebody might be capable of. And I think that was a really tricky moment, Steph, because do you negotiate with Kim? Do you reach out to this new leader, or do you put the hammer down and try to get the country when they're weak?
No, exactly.
Ultimately, what the Obama administration did was to try to keep open the Leap Day deal that they had reached with his father. Of course, what we saw immediately, that Kim was not having it. He was not playing the same game that his father was playing. He was more aggressive. There was more swagger. Within just months of coming into power, he said that they were going to do a rocket launch that failed. He said he was going to do another, and then a nuclear test, and then he was going to do another satellite launch in December, which succeeded. So I think we learned pretty quickly that he wasn't going to just skate on whatever deal his father made. He was going to continue on. It still, I think, remains to be seen whether he was carrying on what his father was going to do anyway, to do a rocket launch in April of 2009. In 2012. So I think that what we saw right away was that he was willing to be aggressive. He was willing to not wait around, and that in purging hundreds of officials, including a very public, very brutal, the execution of his uncle by marriage, and the very brutal public assassination of his half-brother, showed that he was he was not going to countenance any questions about his leadership, that he was quickly going to consolidate. And at the end of the day, he did the right thing, in that in this kind of environment, you're not going to be, that's going to discourage any North Korean official from sticking their head up too high to say, well, I think we should do this policy or that policy. When you see this kind of what some might call unpredictability, unpredictable brutality in this way. So I think Kim came out swinging, and he swung really hard.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, later in the year, and maybe we can get you to join on this one, we're having two young scholars who have been doing work on purges and the sort of logic of purges in authoritarian systems and the way that those affect the consolidation of power. But I already have two questions. I would love to be nerdy and talk about the collapse of the leap year deal and how that happened and what you think of that. But I have two more general questions, which are in some ways wiser than mine. And the first is how do we think of Kim Jong Un in terms of his willingness to embrace reform? Because of course, this was one of the distinguishing features that appeared in his first year. He talked about, we're not going to tighten our belts. And of course, just the projection, his public image, with his wife, Ri Sol-ju, public, visible, well, and you actually talk about this in a very nuanced way, how she dresses, what that meant, the images that are being projected, but also some of the things I think he was doing, just acquiescing, allowing markets to operate. It wasn't top down. It wasn't saying we're going to do X, but it was clear that there was this opportunity provided for private activity. And Pyongyang, is in many ways transformed under Kim Jong Un. It's a very different looking city than it was. What do you say? I mean, is this guy a reformer or is he not?
So the short answer is I don't think he's a reformer, but but as you mentioned, he has opened up some space, a lot of space actually, for market activities. And I wonder how much of those 4 years in Switzerland have contributed to the idea that it's okay to have some of that activity. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to mean the downfall of a particular regime. But I also think that he's savvy enough to know that there is information getting into North Korea. And when I look at some of the things that he's doing in terms of the soap operas, the movies, the things that he is building, that he has built at such a rapid pace since he came to power. His father started these projects, but Kim Jong Un really ramped these up. When I look at the condominiums, the science and tech industry, the luxury department stores, the fashions, the cosmetic stores, the soap opera business, the movie business. When I look at all of that, these are alternatives to what North Koreans would see coming from South Korea or from China. And I think Kim is savvy enough to know that this is a competition for hearts and minds and souls, and that he's trying to create this domestic consumerism that is directed at consuming what is made domestically, to create this domestic market and to lessen the dependence on the outside. I think there is a lot of I think this is a really fascinating issue. A lot of commentators have talked about how, Kim has, I've said in the book how he has also created hope, that there's hope that you can go to Pyongyang and dine at one of these fancy restaurants. There's hope that you can make as much money as, as the elite in Pyongyang, or your neighbor for that matter. The problem is that can Kim continue to deliver on these hopes, or at least enough to outpace some of the disillusionment or some of the disappointment that is sure to that is also part and parcel of this type of economy.
Yeah, well, I really want to come to that trade-off, because obviously there is some kind of trade-off between holding on to the nuclear program, or at least making adequate concessions that you could talk about sanctions relief or get foreign investment into the country. But I have several other questions I just want to acknowledge here that I want to play on. So I haven't kept track of exactly how many days he's gone missing this year, but there have been these periods when Kim Jong Un has been out of view. And there's been speculation that had to do with COVID. There's been speculation has to do with his health. But someone has asked us about his sister, Kim Yo Jong, and whether you think this is a system which could survive a Kim Jong Un death. I mean, which is not completely impossible if we think that he may be in ill health. What do you think?
So I think that, right, so I think there are some studies about how Kim has had the fewest number of public appearances this year. And, I think we still don't know why he was missing for those 3 weeks back in April. It's unclear why he has fewer appearances. It could be a number of reasons. It could be COVID. It could be, other things. I think that's hard to know. But on the core question, what does this mean for the stability or the sustainment of North Korea the way it is? I think that. I think North Korea is more resilient than we think it is. Part of that has to do with the fact of the incredible entrepreneurship and the adaptability of the North Korean people to keep this machine running, to survive, to be able to live under these conditions, to be able to make do and to create create lemonade out of lemons. And also I would argue that there is enough of bureaucratic inertia in North Korea that would, and enough rituals and enough bureaucracies and enough glue there to keep the regime going. That said, I would not be surprised if Kim Jong Un has been thinking about succession for a while, because he has known death from a very young age. His mother died when he was 20. His father had this terrible stroke when he was 24. His father died when he was 26. And so he has known death, and he's known these personal tragedies. And he himself went through a very short, compressed grooming process by his father. So I bet that he's profoundly and very personally aware of how fragile life is and how fragile the regime could be in many ways. And so let's look at the observables of what North Korea is doing. I think it'd be really hard to know if this was all succession related, but at a minimum, what we see him doing with his sister, Kim Yo Jong, is that she's getting more, she's always been there next to him. She was there at the funeral sobbing. She's been his de facto chief of staff for a number of years. Yeah. She's now been issuing statements in her own name. She's been talking or issuing those statements on a variety of things: South Korea relations, US relations, kindergarten or education, and a bunch of other things. But she was also, he also had her order a military attack or military maneuver against the Inter-Korean Liaison Office, which the North Korean military blew up back in June.
She issued that order.
And so yeah. I think what that suggests is that at a minimum, he wants his sister to have the gravitas, to have the credibility, and that for that experience to have a strong military and security component. When I look back on her career, she's got a lot of government experience. She's got the bloodline. I don't think the gender matters as much as long as she's got the bloodline and the fact that she's got her brother's stamp of approval. So she's got the government experience, the bloodline. She's also been there by her brother's side at those major summit events. But what she didn't have, Steph, was that military and security experience. So I think that the Inter-Korean liaison building being blown up under her name or at her orders was designed to give her that credibility with the military.
Yeah, again, there are just so many lines of conversation we could have. I mean, Kim Jong-il didn't have, that military background. Neither did Kim Jong Un as well. And you wonder the extent to which that poses constraints on them compared to Kim Il-sung, who clearly was able to create this myth of being a guerrilla fighter. And he was a guerrilla fighter, even if the effects of his actions were probably exaggerated. But let me just acknowledge one student who's made a very interesting comment I pass on to you. It's Kehan Chen from China. Welcome, Kehan. And he says, I'm in a socialist country. We don't think of socialism as being passing power from father to son. What's that about? And so, Kehan, I can only say that I think Jung and I would agree with you. It's a kind of odd circumstance. But let me turn to, in a sense, the main menu here. I've spent some time looking at the pattern of testing, the pattern of peace regime offers over time. And one of the things that just jumps out to anyone who studies North Korea is that after Kim Jong-il's death, there's just this sharp increase in testing and investment in the military program, less on the conventional side, mainly on missiles and nuclear. What is he doing? That's really, in some sense, the big question. Is this to bargain away? Is this to keep? Is this testing that's aimed at just developing the capability so that North Korea has the deterrent? How do you interpret the tremendous investment in the program since 2012?
So I want to backtrack a little bit on something, on a point that you made earlier about the military, and then I'll address the, what's this all about? Why do we have this acceleration of the nuclear weapons? So on the military experience, you're absolutely right that as the regime keeps passing this down, they're going to face a lot of problems on how to create a martial spirit when there's no war, or when the leader has no war experience. So Kim Il-sung obviously was a guerrilla fighter, and he could, he had that history. With Kim Jong-il, the regime had to work a little bit harder. In that, they would say that as a kindergartner, as a 5-year-old, he was helping his father on the front lines, analyzing air defense, right, during the Korean War. But having Kim Jong-un, born when he is so temporally removed from the Korean War or from any military conflict, that it becomes increasingly difficult to make that credible. I mean, he can't be present at the Korean War. He can't be present during the guerrilla fighting during Japanese colonial rule. And so what the regime does is that what Kim Jong-un does is that he refurbishes all the war monuments. He makes them much bigger. He makes them gorier. He makes them scarier. And that kind of scary. The scariness of the United States, the scariness of the outside world is deeply embedded into the education infrastructure, in the museums, in the culture. And of course, when we have something, and when the regime continues to talk about hostile US policy being the reason for their nuclear weapons program, it's hard to, I think that is part of trying to create that martial spirit, to have Kim own that military, right? That's his military experience. And I think that goes into why he accelerates this nuclear weapons program when he does. I think in the beginning, when the nuclear weapons program was in a much weaker position, it was in a developmental stage, they had to do a ton of testing. That made it more, that increased the possibility and made it more, it made it more possible, or maybe necessary, for Kim Jong-il to bargain, to buy time, to reduce the stresses on the regime financially and otherwise, to test things, to poke and prod, to bargain, to try to glean some or gain some economic and political concessions. But Kim Jong-un inherited an advanced nuclear weapons program. So he not only did he grow up in a North Korea that was economically growing, he was born into he was handed down an advanced, nuclear weapons program. So with that, and with the desire to prove his chops, to make sure that everybody knew that the nuclear weapons program belonged to him, he's the one who accelerated it. He's the one who made sure that, regardless of the financial implications of that, that he pressed the accelerator on this. Look at all of the media pictures. It's Kim holding the, the nuclear war, what they say is a nuclear warhead. He's the one at every ballistic missile test. He's at the when they're trying to test the submarine launch ballistic missile. He is there talking to scientists. He's there at the satellite launch control center. When he was during the fire and fury phase in 2017, when President Trump was talking about locked and loaded, Kim said, you best not mess with me because the nuclear button is in my office, not in the military's office, not in the party's office, it's in his office, right? And so Kim has embraced the war history, but he has embraced the nuclear weapons program and what tremendous things that he has done in advancing them as his saying, the war is won, and I'm going to be the one to make sure that, that we never lose ever again.
Right. Well, it could be read in a hopeful way. If the command and control system is such that it's really controlled by him, then, if he's cautious, which he seems in some ways to be, but this opens another line of questioning. I mean, there are just a million things we could talk about, but let me ask you about the Byungjin line, because this is something that, some of those who are listening might be interested in. When you talked about the military, in the late 90s, in the aftermath of the famine, Kim Jong-il decides on this strategic line of military first. And then there's a lot of discussion about this idea of the Byungjin line, which I think is introduced in 2012 or 2013, right at the sort of start of the regime, which suggested an effort to try to balance the demands of investing in the military with investment in, for example, consumer industries or even in agriculture or in letting the market go. And then that's kind of seemed to go back and forth over the course of the regime. Can you speak to the Byungjin line and whether you think we should even be watching those kinds of pronouncements?
Yeah, I think, the Byungjin line of having your cake and eating it too was different. It was different from what his father was saying. His father would say things like, we have to tighten our belts, it's military first. But Kim Jong Un said, we can have both. We don't have to sacrifice economic prosperity for the sake of nuclear weapons. And I think that that generally Kim does want economic prosperity across the board, not just muddle through. I see it as a sign of his optimism. So recall that as he was doing these ballistic missile tests and doing these nuclear tests and talking about how he's going to attack South Korea and hit the United States, was that this was not helping the tourism industry that he was trying to encourage in North Korea.
The trade-off. That's the
right.
trade-off.
Even as he was building all of, the ski resorts and all of these things, that even despite the sanctions that were placed on, some of the things that he needed for these economic projects, he wasn't, he was bent on having it both. And so, but I think it trickles down in that. It's telling it's a sign and a directive to his officials and to everybody else beneath him to work harder, longer, faster, to make sure that his Byungjin policy comes through, regardless of what Kim is doing on the nuclear weapons program. That's his thing. But with the economic policies, he's much more conservative. Look at who he's kept on board. So even as he's lopping off the heads of the militaries, he's done very little on the economic officials. And that suggests to me that he knows next to nothing about the economy and what to do about it. It signals a profound conservatism, a profound sense of, I don't know what's going on, right? And Steph, you know it better than anybody else about how twisted and corrupted this and labyrinthine this North Korean economy is. I would bet that Kim knows, probably less than you do on how the North Korean economy works. So So I think that goes to some of his kind of dictatorial tendencies to make sure to push that effort down to his officials to keep them working. I think there were some defections early on when this came about because of the tremendous pressures of that. But it also speaks to the fact that he's not sure what to do. And I think that still holds true. The same economic officials around, and the biggest directive on the economy is for his officials to do better.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's socialist exhortation, right? That's the use of exhortation in the absence of incentives. I mean, I'm going to put words in Munsub's mouth, but I think, those of us who kind of look at these economic issues, we see North Korea as a small, basically open economy. And if you're going to do reform and you're a small open economy, there's no way you can do it without doing something about the foreign sector. You have to trade, you have to get investment, you have to get capital flows, you have to get the international financial institutions in there. And nothing he's doing seems to be pushing in the direction of making that opening happen, except with respect to China.
I think that was what policymakers saw as that sliver of hope, right? Because he wants economic prosperity, perhaps we can inject, and this is what President Trump was trying to do, is to say a brighter future for the North Korean people. They kept on talking about that as, we can help you. We can help you with that investment. We can help you with the franchises. We can help you with the technical know-how. We can help you with all of these things. But the Kim regime can't afford those things for their regime survival. They can't afford to have technicians coming in, talking to people in North Korea. But what the regime has banked on is tourism. Tourism is not sanctioned. They're building all of these things for tourists. And so, look at some of the tourist, as a tourist, tourist behavior when they go overseas or somewhere else. They tend to stay in their little resorts and they don't leave. They're not, and so, right. And North Korea has taken that up to the nth degree in terms, because you can't leave, right? You can't leave your hotel without your minders or without your tour group. You see what you're supposed to see. You spend money, lots of it, on basic things like, I remember one visitor told me that she spent $10 on a North Korean won, which is not worth $10, right? But in that way, that, injects money and hard currency into the regime. And the Chinese have been very welcoming of that tourism industry. I think according to Chinese state media, 80% of North Korea's tourists are from China, and they go to China because it reminds them of 1960s China, right? And there a few weeks or a few months ago, there was an article about North Korea saying Kim Jong Un said we're developing a COVID vaccine. And some of the chatter was about how this was designed, this must be for nefarious ends, that they're trying to get, dual use items for their chemical or biological weapons. But I tend to think that it had to do with the fact that Kim wanted to make sure for future tourists that you're not going to get COVID in North Korea, and that our medical facilities, he's building this massive hospital in Pyongyang, and that our medical facilities are top notch. And so tourists, don't be afraid to come to North Korea. So I think it's much more economic driven versus this, it could be both, right? But I think I think that was designed to say North Korea is not this vector, disease vector that's going to deter tourists from coming.
That's a very clever point. Of course, they claim that they have 0 cases, which is just totally implausible. But nonetheless, the regime has taken it very, very seriously. Let me just remind our audience, if you want to join the conversation, please put something in the chat. I'm going to try to monitor and make sure we don't have anything new. James, I'll get back to you in a second. But let me just make sure we're turning to the diplomacy in this last 15 or 20 minutes we have. So where to start? I think we had this tussle before about the Singapore summit. And I think you said you wouldn't have advised Trump to do that. So why don't you walk through how you interpret the Olympic gambit on the part of Moon Jae-in, and the Singapore summit. We'll get to Hanoi in a second.
The way the summit happened, I think it could have worked better. So President Trump, after receiving South Korean envoys who had gone to North Korea to talk about, North Korea's pivot to diplomacy, President Trump unilaterally said in March of 2018 that he would meet with Kim Jong Un, surprising his national security advisors and surprising even the South Korean envoys who were there briefing him on their trip. And so, okay, that was surprising. Maybe that will rejigger the whole dynamics of U.S.-North Korea relations. And with every step of the way, every step of the planning, I was hoping that President Trump would not give a firm date until the working level officials were able to get a better statement.
Well, I agree with you on that.
Or guarantee a better outcome.
Absolutely.
But I think every step, in the steps, most of the steps that were leading up to the summit were marred by the president's obvious desire and enthusiasm for a summit. And I think we saw in some of the recent books that they came out, that he didn't really care what happened at the summit, that he was very much interested in the optics of all of this, being the first U.S. president to meet with the North Korean leader. And so what we came out with in Singapore in June 2018 was a very mild, very tepid statement about Kim Jong Un working toward denuclearization. Maybe that was the best that we could do, but by all accounts, there was the working level officials had very little leverage. Usually we dangle a presidential meeting to get something on the books, to get something firmer. Not to have the president go in and to do the negotiating. And so by having this leader-to-leader meeting and have so little come out of it, it gave Kim the opportunity to ignore the working level conversations, because why would he let things go on if the president was already talking about doing away with the war games, the U.S. and South Korean military exercise.
In the press conference in Singapore.
In the press conference. Why would Kim allow for working level meetings if the U.S. president said, I don't even want to talk about maximum pressure anymore? And so what message also does that send to all of the diplomatic meetings that our officials and others have had in terms of trying to get our allies and partners to implement these sanctions, to make sure that North Koreans are not doing illicit activities in their countries. When the U.S. president is saying Kim Jong Un knows nothing about human rights violations, or why University of Virginia student Otto Warmbier died, that Kim feels very sorry about it, but he doesn't have anything to do with it. Why would anybody else push for human rights? And why would Kim Jong Un deign to meet with working level officials or allow working level conversations if he had the U.S. president on his side, or seemingly on his side? So I think that puts us in a really dangerous position, especially after 2017, when we had a lot of credible reporting and credible fears about a military conflict happening on the Korean Peninsula. What Kim has learned from all of that is that the US is a paper tiger, that it has zero appetite for war on the Korean Peninsula, and that at the end of the day, China will come running and will not abandon the regime, regardless of the 3 ICBM tests or the 6 nuclear tests.
Well, I agree with that 100%. But let me just be contrary on one thing. On the other hand, what has Kim Jong Un gotten from Trump? On the material side, kind of nothing. But let me read a question from James Lee, because he's actually read your book, and he has a question about the book, having read it. He says, in the book, you point to the successes that Kim achieved in the foreign policy realm by holding meetings with the US president. Do you have a sense of whether or not these kinds of intangible gains, like face, status, or prestige, have a different kind of effect on Kim than economic incentives? If they do, can the United States use this as part of a strategy toward the DPRK? And let me just couple that with a very brief observation on the Bolton memoir, because his reading of Hanoi was, in fact, that Kim Jong Un was quite agitated about the fact that Trump was unwilling to do anything on the sanctions front, and certainly not what he asked for.
Yeah, on the meetings, so the intangibles. So what are the intangibles? So the regime has been looking for a de facto, or at least they claim to be a nuclear weapons power. They want to be recognized as such, and for us to get over it. And Kim Jong Un, as soon as he came to power, has, the regime has issued a lot of high-level statements about how we should get over it. We should get over it because North Korea is a nuclear weapons power. They incorporated it into their constitution. Kim Jong Un made it clear that this is his brand. This is his jam. Is the nuclear weapons program, and that they're not going to bargain it away. They're very explicit about that. And if they want any kind of progress with North Korea, the U.S. should just, get away from the old way of thinking about things, and that they should just accept North Korea as this power and just deal with it. And so what those meetings did, with very few concessions, right? I mean, because we have so few leverage points, I think, having that meeting with the U.S. president, the optics of all of that was something that we could have held on to. The military exercises, right? We could have held on to that. That could have been some sort of leverage, but the president already, had called them war games right off the bat. He also, decided to kind of bat away some of the maximum pressure sanctions. He even said on Twitter, right, when Treasury came out with some sanctions and had a bunch of other new sanctions designations in their back pocket, the president said, "Oh no, this is, we're getting rid of. You're not doing that." So and this is what, you can call it intangible, but these have real life consequences. Number one, domestically, let's say domestically speaking, if there were any opposing views in North Korea about the aggressiveness, or qualms about North Korea, about Kim's aggressiveness and how this was hurting the economy or hurting North Korea's livelihood, those voices have been completely negated, right?
Silence,
I mean,
yeah.
there's nothing there, right? So if there was any kind of opposing voice or dissenting percolation of any of that, that's gone. Because Kim got the meeting with President Trump. A second thing is that Kim was very happy with the Singapore summit. I mean, he went out on his own. He was, he was doing some sightseeing before the Singapore summit. He was taking selfies with the Singaporean, I think it was the foreign minister who was walking with him. So he got that. But what that does is that, what these summits do, and the favorability of all of it, is that it reduces the international perception of North Korea's threat because he's done these summits, right?
Oh yes.
There are no missiles. I mean, they didn't give up any missiles. They didn't give up any, fissile material, but the threat is reduced, right? This is when Kim becomes cute, right? He becomes a cartoon character, a cute Hello Kitty cartoon character, in that, here he is slurping noodles with President Moon. Here he is, chatting so amicably with the U.S. president. How could he be this terrible, monstrous, human rights violating dictator? So there's that part. Finally, I would argue that it really gave space for Beijing to relax sanctions. It also gave space for Beijing to, it allowed Beijing to come in and try to jockey for position with North Korea. So while China and the US were on the same side on the maximum pressure, at least in 2017, all that disappeared when President Trump said unilaterally, I'm going to meet with Kim. What happens? That alarms Xi Jinping. And so Xi Jinping summons North Korea for a summit before the Singapore summit. And that makes the two sides start to mend fences because Beijing doesn't want to be marginalized. So there are real life consequences to this. I don't think these are intangible at all. These are hard to measure, I would say, with specific numbers. But all of that is part of what makes North Korea a success over the past decades.
No, I'm sympathetic. I'm sympathetic to that line. I mean, that there was sort of more handed away. But there is that interesting research of Victor Cha's that shows, and I can't remember when he stopped the series on this, where he basically shows that if the North Koreans are negotiating, they're not provoking. That you can at least buy, kind of an appearance of calm, but let's focus in on Hanoi, because that's kind of led us to where we are today. And if Singapore could have been read by Kim Jong Un as a success, it was pretty hard for him to read Hanoi as a success. And Trump just sort of walked away from it and said, I'm not going to do a bad deal. But Kim Jong Un, in the Bolton memoir at the end, is trying to press Trump for something, some concrete concession. He just doesn't get it. So where are we now, Jung? I mean, how do you move forward?
So Hanoi was a tremendous failure for Kim, and I think he was incredibly disappointed. I mean, he took a 67, 68-hour train ride from Pyongyang to Hanoi, and after Hanoi, there were a lot of his negotiators were disappeared after that. So he was, and his sister too was, I think, probably reprimanded. So I think Hanoi for Kim Jong Un was a failure, but it points to the unrealistic expectations that I think Kim Jong Un had, and I think that President Trump had in going in. I remember that, President Trump also scrambled to the DMZ in June just to say hello, right? And that was to say, I think, that was, and I think this is what the Trump administration is continuing to do, is to keep that channel open, make nice, with, exchange letters, presidential letters with Kim to try to keep Kim interested in talking so that he doesn't flout the self-imposed moratorium on nuclear testing and ICBM testing. Where are we now? We're in a really bad place. You have a Kim who probably feels humiliated from Hanoi, who has doubled down on his weapons back in December and previous to that. So after Hanoi, the regime released a series of statements, and Kim also said, we're not going to give up nuclear weapons. I mean, they've doubled down on, they've revived that kind of blustery language about the nuclear weapons program. They've also closed the door, although, some optimists would say that they haven't locked the door on negotiations, but that door is is shut pretty tight. And the regime has been clear that unless the US makes concessions different from Hanoi or different from what was discussed in Hanoi, that North Korea was not going to have any of it. That plus the elections, I just don't see North Korea making big moves this year. I would not be surprised if there's some sort of, kind of demonstration next, if there's a new administration, or even with the Trump 2.0, to say, hey, we're still here and we're still mad. And we still want to, talk about what didn't happen, back in 2019. On the provocations, it depends on what you mean by provocations. I mean, North Korea blowing up the liaison building, is that a provocation? I don't know.
Didn't cross a border and no one was killed. Right?
No one was killed. And these are just, it's the difference of demonstrations versus, and also it goes to what their motivations are. I've already talked about why I think, North Korea blew up the liaison office, but I think, the research and the development is still ongoing. So is that a provocation? No, right? In the classic term, but those, North Korea's illicit activities are still ongoing.
Yeah, so there are a lot of questions. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of them, but let me just close out with one that we can read from Maddie Kasich. She says, where are we now? And also, what do you think will happen with the diplomatic efforts, military flourishes with the upcoming US elections? Now, this gets into speculation of what a Biden administration might do, and I don't necessarily want to go there. But let me just pose a question about sanctions. Do you think that they should be ramped up? I mean, as you made this very important point that Trump had opportunities to use secondary sanctions against Chinese and Russian firms in order to get to the North Koreans, and he basically walked away from that, even after calling Obama weak in that regard. Do you think those are tools that the US should dust off and bring back?
You know, the U.S. has been doing some of that in bits and starts since Hanoi. But I think, you know, I think we have to remember that the sanctions are there to keep us safe, and that we're trying to prevent the spread of or the transfer of sensitive materials to and from North Korea. You know, you don't have to ask me. You have to ask the, you know, the panel of experts and the UN panel of experts who are looking at this very closely, looking from all of the member states' perspectives and from the reporting, that to say that sanctions are in disarray. The sanctions regime is in disarray as there are a number of ship-to-ship transfers of oil between Chinese and North Korean entities. Luxury goods are still getting into North Korea. You know, to the extent that any of our friends and partners see this as a priority, I don't know if that, you know, that you know, they need the U.S. oomph to maintain that kind of momentum. And from Beijing's perspective, China and Russia since late 2018 have been calling for the reduction or the removal of sanctions at the UN.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, if so I think that is, you know, if we're going to, you know, sanctions are something that are those are our tools, our existing tools. They're already on the books. And, you know, we should implement the ones already on the books and make sure that we try to, you know, clamp down on the new ways that North Korea is trying to make money.
Yeah, well, that's a great place to end. We did have this last question about, you know, Kim needing to keep the economy afloat at a time when he's been hit both by Chinese sanctions and by COVID, and whether this is a real moment of vulnerability, which might make a pressure strategy more rational. But Jung, I think I'm just going to close by thanking you so much for agreeing to lead this seminar series off. I mean, couldn't ask for a better introduction, wide-ranging, interesting. You've already got readers here at UCSD who have gone through your book, you should know, and I'm sure you'll pick up some more. But let me just extend a warm thanks to you, to the Korea Foundation for supporting us. Our colleagues up in LA have been very supportive. And please join us on a future seminar if one looks interesting to you. Thanks very much.
I'd love to. Thanks, Steph. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Bye, everyone.